Howard Blumenthal. This is another episode of Reinventing School, and we are in a sequence now where we've been looking at math education and science and social studies and physical education last week. And then, not surprisingly, here comes English or ELA or some combination of reading and writing and a bunch of R's, and we'll kind of sort all that out. We have a good full house today. And students and teachers, which is wonderful, and also sort of an industry expert. And where I want to start, I want to sort of begin on two different paths that I think will interweave. One of them is reading, and the other is writing, which seem very closely tied together. Now, the strangeness of all of this is we've decided in the United States, everybody here is from the United States, that that English as a subject, which also is a language, which also is a culture, from whom we declared independence. So we're not actually English, is a common situation. I was in Brazil and I was trying to convince everybody, you guys are bigger than Portugal. You really could just call the language Brazilian and make them do the same thing. So it's a confusing world, and it has a lot of sort of cultural ties that we don't think a lot about, but we really work hard to inculcate everybody in the population with very similar kinds of learning, particularly in English. So, and that begins early, I think, right? So one of the things I guess we want to start with is, when do you start learning to read? When do you start learning to write? And when do you start developing those very early skills? And then how does it carry through not only 12th grade, but a lifetime? So, Laura, you probably know a lot about this. So I wanted to introduce yourself and tell us where you are and what you do and why that Reading League logo is prominently displayed just over your shoulder.
Absolutely. So my name is Laura Stewart. I'm the National Director at the Reading League, and we are a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to raise the awareness, understanding, and use of evidence-aligned practices in reading instruction. And so, yeah, when you ask about, kind of when do we start to learn to read, really, I would answer from birth. And some people would even say, before that, but from birth, because the origins of learning to read are it's language and it's linguistics and it's the understanding of essentially, how language works. And when you look at some of the evidence that we have around the neuroscience right now, we know that reading is really built in an efficient reading is really built in the neurological centers of the left hemisphere, which is the language centers. And we're really, when we take kids through reading instruction, we are essentially taking those neurons that they've used for language and we're repurposing them. In the grand scope of humanity, reading and an alphabetic system, reading and writing, an alphabetic system hasn't been with us that long. So we don't have a brain that's specifically devoted to that. And so we have to kind of repurpose those neurons. So it really starts with, every utterance we make with our children and also the way our kids look at our faces. When children have that facial recognition and that, mapping with a caregiver's face, they're learning how language works, how language is produced, how it sounds, and how it works. So
So,
really
Hannah,
starts from the beginning.
thank you. Hannah, I think you're the youngest of the students. Do I have that right? You're in 10th grade.
Yes,
So
sir.
I'm going to ask you to reach back and think about how you learned to read, how you learned to write. When do you think that happened? Well, like, what was going on? Were you hanging out like inside your mom at some point and you're like, well, all right, I got to pick up a book now. Like, how does that work?
I mean, I know off of like stories and stuff, they would not with just English, but like Spanish too. They just get all these like they would have words around the house and get us like they would have like we have a piano. So they would write piano and then we would learn that's the piano, or they would make up some songs on how to read and how to remember what each word means. And I mean, I've probably been learning since I was in the womb, just hearing everything. So once you come out, once you learn it, you're like, oh, okay.
So you actually had flashcards in your house in different places. Is that what you're saying?
Different places, like a
Wow.
game.
Cool. And do you still do that?
I don't now, but I probably should. It'd be fun to go back and do it again.
Right. So, so Jessica, give me a sense of what it's like to be teaching um, reading, and at what point do you start thinking about, well, this kid has to get through this stuff before they can get to that stuff, right?
Yeah, so I teach mostly upper level students, juniors and seniors. So by the time they get to me, we're really talking about the type of critical reading strategies they need for complex texts, success on things like the SAT. In fact, that's something I'm working on in my class this week. We were doing some practice SAT passages, and students were really struggling with a text from 1849.
Okay,
So,
roll it back. Rather than going to 1849 for the moment, go back to age 2. Let's do it
okay.
within an individual, right? So, what am I learning when I'm a little kid? I mean, does everybody have flashcards on their piano, or I mean, like, what are the things people do to get that moving, and does it work for most people?
Well, so I've been thinking a lot about this because when I think about when I learned to read, I'm from West Virginia. And so I think Appalachians naturally are storytellers. And storytelling was a huge part of my family, how we learned to do things. We also went to church 3 times a week. And so Bible stories also were incorporated into that. And I think I learned to read because I loved stories so much. And storytelling was such a huge component of my family and my community that then that story, like I knew I had access to stories in books then. So I have taken that actually into my classroom this week because my students were struggling with this old passage from the 1800s. So instead of looking at this essay on architecture from 1849, we're looking at short stories from the 1800s. And I'm trying to give them that element of story to teach them those complex reading strategies. So I think the gateway into this is maybe more to story and storytelling rather than strategies. I don't know. What do the other teachers in the group think?
Well, first I'm going to go over to Nina, who's one of your students, right? And get a sense of what this looks like from the other side. So here's Jessica. You probably don't call her Jessica in the classroom, but in this setting, we will. Who's trying to get you to pay attention and to care. And you have a whole life that doesn't necessarily center on books or reading. It centers on other things in your life. How do you think about literacy? Is it something that, like, yeah, I really got to do that? Or is like, yeah, okay, I have a list of like 100 things and it's like number 82.
Honestly, I would say that literacy is definitely high on the list for me. Neither of my parents are native English speakers, so I guess that English education in the classroom and in school was really important to me growing up. And Mrs. Salfia did an amazing job of kind of connecting literacy to ourselves. A lot of the way we learned in her classroom was learning how to attack different passages and different time periods and different like forms of literature, but also finding out more about ourselves through that, especially through things like her Appalachia unit, which taught us a lot about not only how to read better and become better readers, but also how to, I guess, read ourselves better.
So, so English was not the language that was spoken in your early years at home. There was a different language?
No, it actually was. My parents, neither of them like, grew up speaking English, but when they moved here to the United States, they felt that it was, I guess, important for my sister and me to grow up speaking English as our first language.
And can I ask what language, where they came from and what the language they spoke?
Yeah. They both immigrated here from India. So my dad's native language is Hindi, and then my mom's native language is a smaller dialect in India.
And can you read and write in Hindi and in that smaller dialect?
Yes, sir. They're both, I guess, part of my culture and my heritage. So it's something that I took up.
So can you go into a bookstore in Delhi or similar and go, yeah, I can read that?
Yeah, I think a lot of my Hindi education was off of newspapers, actually. I'd go to India and I would like look at the newspapers and I'd spend time with my grandmother and just kind of like sound out each word. So yeah, I think my reading has gotten pretty strong from that.
And you speaking? Same?
Yes, sir. I speak with my like extended family.
Cool. So you speak 2 languages. Do you speak more than 2 languages or?
So foreign languages are actually an interest of mine. So last year in school, I took AP Spanish, and then this year I'm taking AP French.
Whoa, this comes easily to you?
I wouldn't say it comes easily, but it's something that I'm interested in putting more time into.
Got it. Good. So, Maureen, give us a sense of overview here a bit. We're coming at reading in particular from a number of different angles, from early exposure, flashcards on parts of the house, curiosity from another culture, another language, a desire for parents to Americanize Nina, is right. Um, uh, Going back in history to try to understand that through earlier stories and then breaking it down. So there's a lot of components here. So how do you teach English?
That is an excellent and complicated question that I can't begin to, unpack, as it were, in this conversation. But I can say that when I was a maybe 3 or 4 year veteran of classroom teaching, so still kind of on the new side, but felt like I should really have this down at this point, I went to a conference for English teachers because I felt like I'm just out here failing every day. I don't understand what's going on. So I went to a conference for English teachers and I approached one of the speakers after his session and said, why is this not working? Every semester, every year, I have kiddos. I was teaching 9th grade at the time. I said, I can't help them. And this very eloquent, well-educated expert looked me in the eye and said, English hard. That's why. That's why. Because like Laura was talking about, you're trying to take these neurons that are designed and used for oral language, and you're trying to redirect them and say, hey, I need you to look at ink on paper and turn that into oral language. And sadly, a lot of teachers, especially at the secondary level, from upper middle school all the way through high school, we really don't get any training whatsoever on teaching kids how to read, which I found out the hard way when I jumped down to 7th grade to teaching 7th grade. And I had a very sweet child who really wanted to participate. And finally he stayed after class one day and said, Miss Dawes, I can't do it. I see the lines on the page, I feel the paper, it's not words to me. And I wanted so badly to help this guy. And I told him, buddy, nobody ever taught me how to teach you that. So we ended up spending the rest of the year trying to get him in touch with reading experts, reading supports, external services that could teach him how to read, because I, as an English teacher, didn't actually know how to do it.
How'd that go?
Tough.
Okay, fair enough. All right, I'm going to stop you there for a second. Ashley, why is this so hard? And tell us who you are and where you are and all that stuff, right? Yeah.
All right. I'm Ashley. I'm actually currently an administrative intern at a high school, but previously I was.
And explain what that means. That doesn't mean you're a college in like.
No. So basically, it means I'm learning how to be a school administrator.
Okay. Thank you.
Previously, I was a reading specialist and an English teacher at a high school. And the English class I taught was
in where? In Virginia?
Also in Henrico.
Yeah. In Virginia. In Virginia near Richmond, right?
Yes, yes, in Virginia, right outside.
Go on,
Richmond.
yeah.
So I taught reading to 9th graders, and I was a school reading specialist. So I also worked with teachers on integrating literacy into their content, because like Marin said, as secondary teachers, when we go to school, we major in our content, like we major in our subject. So like for English teachers, you major basically in English literature. You take some other classes in education and you get endorsed, but your specialty is really in English literature and studying literature. So I have my master's degree in reading, so I'm a licensed reading specialist as well. But all that to say, there are so many components to reading. And I think also, to go back to what Marin said, as English teachers, we are focused on teaching literature and not actually teaching the skill of reading. Like I was just having a conversation the other day with one of my colleagues, and I was saying, giving kids 15 minutes of silent reading every day is not teaching them how to read. Like it's nice to have the extra time, but reading has to be explicitly taught like everything else. It's not just something we, as I think as high schoolers, rather, we can just not teach the skill, especially if the student is struggling in the skill.
Okay. English major. So I went through this and I was astonished that being an English major really meant reading and then sitting with 30 other students who knew less or as this much about it as I did, which was nothing, even after we'd read it, and then listening to a rather boring conversation almost regularly about a book that I had no desire to read before I'd read it and still no desire to read after I'd read it, right? So there's a big part of this that doesn't make sense. And just to get the rest of the rant out, and reading 3 Shakespeare plays a week was not the ideal way to teach me Shakespeare in college, but we'll get there. So Andrew, we haven't heard from you yet. Tell me about what grade are you in, where are you, all that stuff, but tell me what you like to read and tell me what you read in the classroom. And are they the same or different?
So my name is Andrew Schweer. I'm a student at Spring Mills High School in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and I am one of Miss Selfia's students. As far as what I like to read, I often find I like to read what entertains me. So usually fiction, but also maybe some factual stuff like history or something like that.
Can you name some books you've read within the last year or two that you liked?
I often resort to Stephen King just because I find his stories so interesting and fascinating.
Cool, good. And what about nonfiction?
Nonfiction, I recently read a book about Lincoln and his life and his murder. And
good. Okay, fair enough. And are those books that are assigned? I'm guessing Stephen King isn't assigned very much in an English literature curriculum, but I could be wrong. So what are you assigned reading? What are you required to read?
So I'm in AP. I am in AP Lit right now. Currently, we just finished reading Slaughterhouse-Five and Beloved, and we're going to be moving on to Shakespeare next week.
Good. And when you're doing Shakespeare, you're going to do all of it next week, or are you planning to just one play or one sonnet or something?
We're focusing specifically on Othello.
Got it. Very good. And I'm assuming Jessica or somebody, okay, Cavetta, I haven't spoken to you yet. I'm sorry. And you're right at the center top of my screen. Give me a sense of how Andrew, who's in AP Lit, give me a sense of he's reading Stephen King, but that's not what's being taught in the classroom. How do the interests of students map on to, I'll call it the interest of teachers or schools or curriculum, or maybe the person up in the top rung of the state who's looking at a list of books going, let's make sure the students read that one. Like, how does it work? Who makes those decisions, and how does Andrew fit into this?
Okay. Well, afternoon, everybody. I'm Cavetta from Henrico, Virginia. And
also
I would
near
say,
Richmond, right?
Yeah. I would say that kind of depends upon the school division, and where the schools are located. Some have more autonomy than others. I would say I am fortunately in a school division that has a lot of autonomy in that regard, and is very much a proponent of culturally responsive teaching. So
What does that
a
mean?
lot of
What does that mean?
So culturally responsive means, like, I guess in a simple way would be, choosing instructional strategies, texts, and materials that are in some sort of way appealing to students based upon their cultural backgrounds, ethnicities, and experiences. So it doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, I'm just going to take the Black book and give it to all the Black children. It means that you kind of create and open the door for everybody so that kids are able to see themselves and what they're reading and doing in your classroom, and also see what the world looks like elsewhere in addition to that. So in other words, making literature more well-rounded than what it was when some of us were in school.
And why? What's the point? Why go through all that effort?
I think that, for me as an English teacher now, I think that my goals and priorities for my students when they leave my classroom is a lot different. For me, literature needs to prepare you for the real world. And, the real world isn't only Edgar Allan Poe and Shakespeare. While those things are invaluable, especially for, college-bound kids, like somebody like Andrew, if he's in AP English, he's going off to college next year, and so more than likely he needs to really be able to digest very complex literature. I have ninth graders, so I weave that stuff in and out throughout the school year. But if that was all that they saw all year long, I would lose my kids. I don't think that they would stay engaged. And what I'm finding with my students, coming in out of middle school, is that the love of literacy kind of takes a nosedive after elementary school. Um, you know,
Why?
and well, I think that the pressure to meet standardized testing expectations is one. Teachers teach what has to be tested. And so as a result of that, autonomy and creativity kind of gets left on the back burner. And so if you're sitting in a classroom and your experience with English has always been read this short story or read this book and answer these same types of questions, it kind of, I would say, mutes the passion for literacy versus what you probably experienced, in elementary school, where there were tons of books that you could probably choose from. Or, your teachers reading I think most people remember or have really fond memories of their elementary school teachers reading books out loud to them, or their parents even reading books to them, or whatever your experiences were. I developed actually a love of literacy through church growing up back home in South Carolina. And so for me, literacy was connected to my family, and in particular, my church family. And also, it also provided like a stage for me as well. So like growing up, we had the Easter Sunday speech. I had to make sure that I read and studied my Sunday school lesson so that if my Sunday school teacher asked me questions, I could answer them. There were oratorical contests, what have you. And so for me, literacy kind of started out as one of those things where I needed to know what I was looking at so that I could talk about it. And what I find in that, I would say specifically for, I would say Black communities, literacy, is more so connected to that oral piece, that storytelling factor, I think is what deepens the connection for most people. So when you go from that, similar to what you see in like elementary school, and transition into being able to read only so you can pass a test, it's not engaging.
Yeah.
And
All right.
so,
So let's talk about engagement.
I'm trying to.
So we all read books. Yes. Fair assumption. Just looking at everybody on the screen, everybody shaking their head. Yes. So at a certain point, this book is boring. I have no desire to read this entire book. Right. And I always feel a little guilty. Maybe I missed it. Maybe I was snoozing a little bit while I was reading. Maybe I need to start again. Maybe I need to put it aside and come back to it, whatever. But there's a point, I'll call it 25% of the way into the book, when this ain't working. This is just not a book that I'm going to end up reading. But it's assigned. It's part of what I have to do. And by the way, my time as a student is limited, and I've already devoted this amount of time. So, Hanna, do you ever walk away?
This last time, hi everybody, I'm Hanna and I'm a 10th grader and I go to, but yes, I mean, you do walk away in some instances. In, what was it? I think 6th grade, I was reading the Hunger Games and I think, I don't know, maybe I wasn't focused with it or something, and it just became just not interesting anymore, probably because we had a chart on how many books you read, so we were all trying to get the chart up and it was just a mess. So I walked away from that book, but I do have it at home, so I want to revisit it because I think now I might understand the literacy better and everything better as I'm older, or I might just have more interest because like as time goes, you like new things, maybe things you didn't like before. So I always want to revisit books that maybe I didn't like, but I think sometimes you do walk away.
Marin, what have you walked away from?
I have walked away from so many books and clung tightly to others that other people hate. Right. One of my principles of teaching literature to high schoolers was there are more books in the world than you can ever read. So if you come across one, and we would usually have a number rule, like you have to give it 50 pages, okay. Like really give the author a chance to get your attention. But if it's not grabbing you, there's not enough time in life. Ditch it. Unless, because practicality is key, you've got to be able to read and understand and work with it for your class. Then we would talk about practical strategies to do that. Maybe you need to listen to an audiobook and go for a run, because at least you can get your exercise in, you can train for your sport. Something. There's got to be a way to get what you've got to have, but really save up your brain power and your emotional power for the things you really want to do.
Okay, Nina, walk away. Have you walked away?
I've definitely walked away from a lot of books, but I realized that I've come back to a lot of them and really enjoy them on that second read.
Really? Give me an example.
So I read Little Women when I was probably in fourth or fifth grade. Yeah, and I got through it and I was like, man, that was okay. And then I came back to it in 8th or 9th grade and I read it and I was like, oh, this is much better than I realized it was when I was little.
There you go. Okay. Now, a lot of students, and you guys all clearly care about reading and English and all of that. A lot of students don't, right? So, and Laura, you're going to know this information probably better than I will. But I think about 1 in 3 adults actually reads a book most don't in any given year. It just, whatever it is that we're doing and doing presumably well in earlier grades that falls apart a little bit in later grades, by the time we're in adulthood, I mean, my place is buried in books, because there are used bookstores and because now is a particularly good time and because the Harvard bookstore just had a warehouse sale, and why not for $3 or $4 or whatever. But most people, when they come in here, going, why do you have all these books? So, and that's really the normal, I think, is most people don't have a lot of books in the house, and most people don't often go to the library. Most people don't read books. So there's a mismatch here somewhere. Can you sort that out for us?
You know,
Or my stats wrong. If my stats are wrong, correct me.
yeah, and actually, I don't have the stats on how many adults read a book. I don't have that. But I think one thing that's worth kind of examining is when you look at the number of let's think about students. The number of students we have in this country who are proficient in 4th grade as readers and 8th grade as readers. It's only about a third of our kids. So we have about 2/3 of our students who, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, aren't proficient readers at 4th grade or 8th grade. And so that proficiency, I think, really drives the desire. It drives the ability to read fluently with understanding. So I think part of the issue is really reckoning this idea that we know there's, I mentioned the evidence base. There's a strong evidence base for how we teach kids to read. We know with good instruction, we can teach 95% or more of our kids to read. So there's a disconnect between what's happening in the early grades and getting kids to proficiency. And I wanted to mention something that Maren said about teacher prep and how secondary teachers, they're not instructed on how do we teach kids how to read. And so one of the things we have to reconcile, I think, is instruction really matters. Early instruction really matters. So how do we make sure our teachers in the early grades are really well equipped to teach all kids to read, so that we don't have this cycle of failure that gets more and more serious as time goes on, and then eventually leads to, at worst, illiteracy, but at, even moderately leads to a disinterest in pursuing, reading books.
Andrew, you're in an AP Lit class, but I'm going to ask you to take yourself out of that environment and think about the whole school. Kids reading or kids avoiding reading?
I guess I would say it depends on the student. I think some students are more motivated than others.
Let's talk about the less motivated ones for a bit. Because if very few people are buying books and visiting libraries and all that, I'm going to guess that you got a lot of unmotivated students. And as Laura just said, you got a fair amount of illiteracy or at least lack of interest in the upper grades. So does that come up in conversations? Do people hide it? Are they ashamed of it? Is it some things like, yeah, I don't care about books? Like, what's going on?
I think many students who aren't as motivated often have that stereotype that, hey, the books in class we're going to read are boring. They're not worth it. when in fact, like Miss Salvia, for example, in our class, try to connect the books we read to make them more entertaining for those students who are struggling. For example, she assigned over the summer before our class, she assigned a book about the opioid highway crisis and how it affected our town of Martinsburg.
In a significant way. So, Jessica, give us a sense. You got a room full of kids who are like, yeah, we're really not going to read anything you're telling us to read. We're just not interested. So you can talk about it all you like. We're just not doing it. Do you run into that?
All the time. And I think Laura made a really good point about this disconnect that happens between elementary school and middle school. And I think one thing that happens around that time is kids have been given access to a lot of really high interest texts that they connect with culturally and in terms of ability level. And then at some point, someone made them read a book that they hated all the way from start to finish, from
Ivanhoe.
to
Ivanhoe.
to the last page, and then that was it, and then that killed it for him. The other thing is that high school teachers don't get, as we've said several times, I'm so glad, I think Cavetta brought that up maybe, don't get training to teach reading. And what we did at our school a few years ago was we actually had an elementary school literacy coach come in and run a professional development for our English department. And so what we've tried to focus on is making sure that our classroom libraries are stocked with a lot of really high interest novels that the students can see themselves reflective in. I would say that we have one of the most culturally diverse classroom libraries and novel closets in the state of West Virginia. And so I think just trying to figure out in that moment, responding immediately to your students and what they find interesting and what they need and what their ability levels are, and then finding that right text for them. No kid should be forced through a book that is making them hate reading or that is making them miserable.
And yet we do it all the time, right?
Well, I mean, not at Spring Mills High a whole lot. I mean, we're really trying to shift it over here. I mean, we're really putting in some work to make sure that that is not happening. But yeah, you run into kids who are adamantly non-readers and you address it as they come. What are you interested in? What do you like? Maybe let's try this short story about this thing. I found a great collection of Pete Egan Road and Track magazine, a Road and Track magazine article anthology that I love to hand to those auto mechanic kids. Like, oh, I don't need this. I'm going to be a diesel mechanic. I'm like, well,
right.
I got the book for you.
So you're in West Virginia. How are you doing on literacy across the board?
Well, I can't quote the West Virginia numbers off the top of my head.
Probably not top 10. Is that a fair assumption?
No, I wouldn't say top 10. I know that our school's SAT scores recently came back and we had done quite well this past year.
Good.
So that's the one number I'm clinging to, is that at Spring Mill High, our recent SAT scores were pretty good, above the national average. Mm-hmm. But West Virginia as a whole, I can't tell you.
But I think it's not good, right? Unfortunately. So why is it not good?
Well, I mean, I think that there's, how much time have you got? I mean, there's a lot of things happening in the state.
Some of the hits.
If we want to talk about the culture of extraction that has existed in this state and created, several different types of system of oppression, the opioid epidemic that we've been battling in this state for, I don't know how long, the collapse of the coal industry in this state, the continued and repeated attacks on public education by our own lawmakers in this state. So we've been fighting an uphill battle here for years, for generations. So I think all of those things are.
What does coal have to do with literacy rates?
So if we're talking like 50 or 60 years ago, this state was, we were booming. This was a booming place with a growing diverse population, and Welch and McDowell County, West Virginia was called Little New York. And there was a lot of emphasis put on strong communities and schools, and there was ample funding for those things. And then as we've seen a decline in local economies, we've seen budget cuts to school systems, to professional development opportunities for teachers, to support systems for teachers, to resources like diverse novels or engaging novels, or opportunities for teachers to get trained on how to address literacy issues in high school and middle school students. So it ultimately all comes back to funding.
And it's related to health. It's related to divorce. There's a whole cluster of behaviors, right, that if you are literate, you are more likely to blank, 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 and you are less likely to blank, blank, blank. So, Ashley, can you fill in the blanks, some of them, and explain why? What's going on here? Why would reading a book have anything to do with your likelihood to smoke?
With smoking, or I would attest to health in general.
Okay.
Health literacy. The more literate you are, the higher that you go in education, right? So the more literate you are, the more degrees that you're going to have, the more likely that you're going to college, the more likely that you're going to graduate from college, the more likely you're going to grad school, PhD, etc. So we all know that with jobs that you get with degrees and PhDs and that kind of thing comes with healthcare, with access to healthcare, access to affordable healthcare. So
and
you're more
knowledge,
likely,
right? And knowledge of how the body works.
and knowledge, yes, absolutely, and knowledge of healthcare.
But
so you're more likely
of us, 2/3 of people who live in the United States do not finish college. We have a very low rate of people who are college graduates. So, Cavetta, how do you think about that, knowing you're pushing the ball uphill in a big way? You've got to be seeing a lot of kids who are like, well, this is not going to happen, but I don't want to contribute to that 2/3 problem. How do you
Well,
think about that?
I think the trends that we see in education match the culture of the country, which is to push, 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 make sure you achieve the American dream, and unfortunately, in my opinion, and just from what I've seen, and I think there is research to show that I think American school systems do a lot to push kids to do things that they may not necessarily be developmentally ready for. Who says you have to be reading by the age of 5? Well, if you can't read by the age of 5, you're going to have a label on your back until until further notice. And I think that when it comes to success in college, a lot of what I feel is missing from school and kids' learning experiences is the practicality and the value, and going off to college, understanding why you're there, connecting the dots between what it is that you're studying and what you intend to do when college is also said and done, and also being able to finance it as well. If you're a first generation college student and you're the first one who was successful in school and you go off to college, but you don't have the support and the resources that you need to stay there, that could be a challenge as well.
But so how does reading tie into any of that? What's the connection? Is there a connection?
Absolutely. Well, you think it starts as a kid, right? If you grow up in a household that is full of books with people who are reading to you every night, you start school more literate than some of your peers.
But most kids don't grow up in those circumstances. They grow up in the opposite of those circumstances now, at least
I
from
think
the
that's a
statistics that I'm
generalization.
reading. Okay. Push back,
I think that's a
please.
generalization. I think that there are a lot of kids who start out, and I think there's just as many who are probably on the other side of it as well, because the reality now is that kids' parents are working, and trying to make it. And so it may not be I don't want to read to my kid every night. It's just I got this third shift job I need to get to. And I think some of the responsibility to promote and encourage and foster literacy ends up falling on schools and English teachers, and we can't do it all by ourselves. There really has to be a community partnership.
Okay, so Laura, let's go back to the pushing the ball uphill. This is more not working than it's working according to the statistics. We have a nation that operates at a fairly low literacy rate. The job market, which by the way only affects 1 in 2 people directly, because half the people don't work, in part because they're students or they're older or they're simply not working. So how important is this as a means of economic development? And does the economic development component here match an economic development in a much lower income country? I mean, in sub-Saharan Africa, we're really pushing hard on getting girls into school and developing literacy and all that. I think of us in many ways as more similar to what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa than I do in France. I think our rates are absolutely terrible, and you guys are working so hard
Yeah.
to make the opposite of that true, but it's not true. So what do you do with that, Laura? How do you think about
Yeah.
that?
Well, I wanted to mention something about the college. We know that going into college, that 40% of our college freshmen need some sort of remedial help with reading.
Yeah.
And so when you think about the complexity of the text that college students are asked to deal with, if there's a problem there, what does that mean for 11th grade, 10th grade, 9th grade, 8th grade, all the way back to the beginning? And I'm relatively hopeful, because I think, again, I mentioned this body of evidence we have about how we teach children to read effectively. And when we can get that into, proliferate that into teacher preparation for all teachers to understand, and when we have a concerted effort for all stakeholders to understand how important it is that we embrace evidence-aligned instruction, I think we can move the needle. And when you mentioned, I think everybody's a stakeholder here, right? Like, Joe Businessman, he is a stakeholder in this, because the children in his community, we want them to be literate citizens of the 21st century, so they can, they can be great employees, and parents are stakeholders, and policymakers are stakeholders.
Yeah,
Teachers obviously
that
are
all sounds great,
stakeholders.
but there's certainly a race component in education in the United States. Um, Somebody want to grab that, Ashley? I mean, not there. It isn't fair. The way that
Yeah,
are distributed is not fair. The way school budgets are put together, or what teachers are paid, or the opportunities that are provided to the students, or the
It's true.
remedials, it's not fair. And yet we're saying everybody has to read at a certain level because that's what the testing says. This starts not making sense to me, but maybe it's just me. Ashley?
no, I agree with you. I think that further needs to be done to address the gaps that exist, especially when you're looking at literacy scores. Like, I look at literacy scores in Virginia and the ones that are on the school quality report on the DOE website. And in some, like our EOC end of course reading SOL, for example, why is it that Black students are performing 20% lower than white students in some districts? Why is that, when they're going to the same schools?
So why is that? What is the reason?
I think it attests to some of the things that have already been stated here, is that the cultural competency in classrooms, the cultural relevance. If I am a student and you are consistently teaching things to me that I'm not interested in, I'm going to become disengaged, and therefore I'm not, I'm going to fall behind because I'm disinterested, if that makes sense. And so then the gap begins, and it just divides further, because it's almost like I'm not connected to what is being taught to me. Therefore, I'm not digesting it because it does not connect to me. And I'm a child, so you can't say, well, you should pay attention anyway. It's like forcing kids to read books that they aren't interested in is not helpful, because they are not gaining any skill, because they're not taking anything in.
Nina, what do you think?
I agree with that. I think that it's definitely very easy to get disengaged from a book that you have no interest in, but I also I think that by having certain books that we read in the curriculum, and we have to stick with them, I think it also opens us up to different genres that we wouldn't have maybe touched on our own.
Yeah, if you're paying attention. Hannah, what do you think?
I agree with everything that was said. I believe also on let's say about the tests, English tests, some things could be some sayings, like how they word things. Not saying people talk ghetto, nothing like that. It's just sayings. Because your mother might say something this way and someone else's mother says something this way. It's what you hear every day. So if something is over explained, like on some MAPS test or SOLs, some things in my opinion are over explained, which can be confusing because you sit there and look like, what? Like, this could be explained way simpler, less words, and you still get the same question across. So
when I'm reading a book alone. And it's a very individual experience. When I'm writing, and I do a lot of writing, I'm writing alone. And I'm often surprised that other people actually read what I wrote, because I wrote it in my little room here. It never occurred to me that it would actually go into the outside world. So it's a very individual activity. But in school, reading is a group thing. Let's all sit and read the book. It's like, you know what, guys? No, I don't want to do that. I'll read if you want me to read, but the form of doing this to me seems the opposite of the way I learn. Marin, can you sort that out at all? Or am I just strange, which is possible?
Yeah, some. So we are learning more and more about how the human brain works. And as we learn how the human brain works, we're able to kind of design backwards and say, how do humans learn? And so humans learn through dialogue with one another, just like we're doing right now. And we've touched quite a bit on storytelling and oral tradition and how important those are in culture. So the shortest and best answer is this is kind of a both and situation. There are obviously people with really strong introverted abilities who do in fact learn best on their own and process best on paper, working on their own, and then they can come to the group. But there are people who work and learn better in groups of humans. And so one of our jobs as English teachers is trying to balance those strengths and trying to figure out who needs what in order to be the most successful.
So let me use the phrase, shut up, I'm trying to write. Okay, just as a broad thing. If you're sitting and trying to write, writing is hard. English, you said before, was hard. Writing's the really hard part. You start out facing this page or this screen, there's nothing there. Somehow you've got to be able to put a bunch of clear thoughts together. If you're writing fiction, you also have to do it imaginatively in ways that you're hoping other people will engage with. Right. I mean, one thing, if you're writing nonfiction, keep it clear, keep it moving, make it somewhat vivid, make it descriptive. I can do that. And then you can look at it and go, yeah, this is competent. Maybe it's even good. But if I'm writing fiction, that's a whole different game. But the idea of writing itself, and certainly the reading topic is sufficiently interesting that we've managed to fill over 3/4 of this conversation with it. But let's switch over to writing. So, Nina, you a good writer? And if so, how'd you become a good writer?
I'm not sure if I'm a good writer. I think Miss Salvia probably has a better idea if I am or not.
Well, just quickly
Nina
then. Jessica, is she a good writer?
She's an excellent writer.
Good. Okay, Nina.
One of the best
Nina, you're an excellent writer. How'd you figure out how to do that?
Honestly, I think that it was a lot of practice. For me, one of the biggest struggles I have with writing is that I tend to be a perfectionist and want everything to be perfect on the first time, or like the best work that I can ever put out. Like for Miss Salvia's semester exam, I rewrote my essay 3 different times because I wasn't happy with it. But I think that part of writing is kind of, I guess, getting over that hump and being willing to put out your ideas in, I guess, the strongest way you can and the most effective way you can.
So here's what I learned, and I do a lot of writing. It doesn't matter what you write at first. It only matters what you write at last. So, Andrew, good writer?
I'd like to think I'm a good writer.
Okay. And you're also under Jessica's teaching. So, Jessica, is he a good writer?
He is an excellent writer. These
Very
are 2
good.
of the best students I've taught in years.
Okay. So, Andrew, how'd you learn to write?
I would say I learned to write based upon, like, I guess it started with writing assignments. Like you had to write a certain essay on a certain subject, and I learned to do it from that based upon the need to want a good grade, of course. But I also think the struggle is definitely a part of it. You have to push through before you get to that success. So,
Hanna, good writer? So?
I'm not good. I would say I'm a good writer.
Okay.
My parents are
One
both
second.
talented.
Ashley, how's she doing?
I have never actually taught Hannah. She's at my school, but I'm not in
Okay, good. All right, fine. So we'll just have to take Hannah's word for it. So you think you're a good writer. Keep going.
Both my parents are talented. My brother's my dad draws, my mom does poems. So maybe that was just in my DNA. I don't know. But like they would always tell me stories. We have a whole bunch of books everywhere. And I remember in elementary school, all my teachers would then make up your own story. and I have all of them like around my room. Just make up random stories, and I do that all the time. I might listen to a song and I put in a playlist, and then I make a story off of that. So I think it's just being creative and just looking at the world as an outlet, and then you just build off of that. Honestly,
How often do you write?
I should write more, but I write in my head, but say I write it down, barely. I need to do that more, but I write a lot in my head. I have a whole bunch of words in my head all the time.
Fair enough. Cavetta, of the 100% of students that you've taught in your how many year career?
7.
Okay. How many students do you see in a year?
I'd say on average about 115 to 120.
Good. Okay. So 7 gives you 700, 840. So you've taught almost 1,000 kids. So if you were to take those 1,000 kids and kind of put them in buckets, really good writers who can go much further, and the bucket on the other end is like, oh my gosh. So
Yeah.
how do they sort out?
How many buckets do I have?
As many as you want.
Okay. I would say really good writers, maybe like 300 of those.
Okay. And of those 300, how many of them could reasonably get published if they wanted to, and published in a meaningful way, not just like a small one-time thing, but actually like, yeah, you're a writer?
You know what? That's hard to say, because I think that kids have been so conditioned to write in a certain kind of way.
Okay, fair enough.
So I think that what is expected of them as far as writing is concerned versus what they might do to publish professionally might be very different. For me, and I would say even too, as an English teacher, when I think of good writing, sometimes my heart just skips if I see periods and capitalized words. It makes me so happy, because, so, and while that's very small, right, it seems like it's not that big of a deal. But, sometimes for it to click for my kids, I'll have to say, guys, just make sure it doesn't sound like a text message.
Yeah. All right. So, so you got a bunch of buckets, and you got 700 more kids. Where are you putting them?
I'm just going to put them, in the other bucket. It's just going to be a really big bucket
of kids who really aren't, like, if writing were a weapon, you wouldn't want to put the weapon in their hands, kind of thing?
Oh, no, I wouldn't get away free, I don't think.
Okay. So for me, I've never thought of myself as a particularly good writer, but I've thought of myself as a fast writer who writes a lot. And over time, people have said, you know what, you're a pretty good writer. I'm like, really? I thought I was really not that good, but I was fast. So somewhere in here, you gain confidence. And it's clearly one of those disciplines where the more you write, and the better you get. And then you read and you guys should do it that way or whatever. But if you've got 700 kids in that other bucket, it ain't working that way for a lot of them, right? So is that because they're afraid to write? Is that because they don't have, like, I'm pretty good, if you ask me, like, where should a semicolon be? I can usually answer that reasonably well, but I know that most people I know struggle with that, right? So is it the tools that are holding it back, or is it, as I suspect, the ability to be able to think clearly about what you need to say and how to say it? Give me a sense of what's happening there. And you think about that for a sec. Marin, go, let's get something from you quick.
So I actually come at it from a different perspective.
Okay.
I very much learned to write by reading. And I think most of the people that I know who say, oh yeah, writing, like I really understand it, I'm really good at it, they also tend to read a lot. So I tend to teach writing from the perspective of, what have you seen? Okay, mimic the master. Like choose somebody, choose something that you've seen on paper that you liked, and try to do that until you can do it on your own. Or go the other direction and say, okay, you know what? Reading's not working, but you're really good at talking. You speak English, right? here's a microphone, here's a voice to text tool, talk. And then once you've got something on the page, we can work on making it make more sense.
So Laura, you've got the reading league. Is that because the writing leaguers didn't make the league? Like, what happened?
Oh, actually, you know what? We're really just trying to laser focus on helping equip teachers to be able to better teach children to read, so that we can really impact reading achievement in this country.
So you've segregated it.
Writing's, yeah, well, not really. I mean, writing and reading are pretty interconnected, and so that same neural pathway I was talking about earlier is really necessary for writing as well. And the principles of instruction that we need to employ for reading really also match the principle of instruction for writing. But we're really, the reason we're called the Reading League is because that's really our main focus.
Okay. No, I was making fun, obviously. But Jessica, can you teach somebody to write? Like, is that a skill that's teachable, or do you just kind of have to have native talent? Like, I'd love to be a really good baseball player. It ain't going to happen.
No, I think you can. I think like a combination of what Cavetta and Marianne both said, I use in my class. I tend to use a lot of mentor texts and a lot of models.
What do you mean by mentor text?
So like, we're going to read this passage or this essay or this paragraph by this master writer. You're going to write your version of this with your content, but I want you to imitate form, style, sentence structure, punctuation nearly to the letter. All right.
Oh, I would hate that. Oh,
well, it seems to work pretty well if you are a struggling writer. And I also try to give directions on my task sheets with a strong sense of my voice. Like, students have often said, wow, when I read this task sheet, it sounds like you're talking to us.
Okay.
And so then I get to say, well, that's how you're a good writer, when you can hear the person's voice while they're talking to you. But I think, like, using strong models, like showing them the masterwork, saying, you think this is good writing, okay, let's imitate this sentence.
I'll think about Robert Caro, for example, as an extraordinarily good writer. John McPhee is an extraordinarily good writer. When I read their stuff, it makes me not want to write, because there's no way I'm ever going to be, that guy. Cavetta, what do you think? Can you teach me to write? Can you teach me to write better? Or worse, can you teach me to write gooder?
Oh man. You know what? I think I'm a pretty good coach. I do. Just thinking about some experiences that I've had, because I was concerned about writing instruction with us being virtual right now. I was like, I don't know how this is going to work. And what I'm finding is that kids actually like to be coached one-on-one through their writing. And I think it's that personal piece that's been missing. And I think some of it is helping them to kind of lower and let their guards down. I think to what you asked a little earlier, kids really overthink writing a lot. They have this expectation that my English teacher wants my writing to look this kind of way, and I'm going to spend 3 hours making sure it looks the way I think my teacher wants it to look before I even turn in the draft. And I have to say, sometimes it's really not that serious. Just get it out of your head, and I can coach you through the rest. And so when I find that, like, I can really show them the areas to concentrate on, that's number one, is making sure that kids see that, my writing really isn't that bad. It's maybe only 2 or 3 areas I should focus on versus, the red pen strategy where there was 15 things you needed to fix. And that can become kind of cumbersome. So I think a lot of it boils down to making kids feel good about what they can already do, and coaching them the rest of the way.
Subjective, though. And I'll take that from 2 perspectives. One, when I write, if somebody marks up the entire page with red pencil, okay, I'm not thrilled on the one hand. On the other, I know that that's the way I'm going to get this page to be better. So after I grumble and moan about it, I'll maybe do something about that, right? And I'm actually learning in the process. But the flip of that is, when somebody gives me something as a producer to look at, I've reduced very professional writers to tears, because I hear it in my head one way, and that subjective version is what I want because I'm the boss, I'm the teacher, I'm the whatever. So I'm imposing my values on something and not allowing the writer, or greatly improving the writer. So Andrew, what's your take on that?
So the question was, what is my take on what? Can you repeat it one more
Are
time?
editors the devil, or
I think like some of the other teachers talked about that, like one-on-one personal connection when we're editing our writings after we submit it really helps. For example, I remember in elementary school when we would write creative stories, my teacher would sit down with me one-on-one and tell me, like, this is really good. You need to work on this though. And that continues throughout high school. I know plenty of examples of my teachers sitting me down and saying, hey, this is really good,
but
you could also work on this to make it better.
But that word "but," Ashley. So you're a really good teacher, but
I think that because you're right, it is a lot of kids. What I noticed is that they are afraid kind of to pour their heart out on paper because sometimes they've only been taught a strategic way to write. You start with your introduction, then you have your second paragraph that has one detail, and your third and fourth that have one detail, and then you conclude it. And I would get kids I'd be like, all right, y'all respond to a question, like a journal entry, and they would be trying to write it in 5-paragraph essay form. And I think that some of that creativity has been lost. So therefore, the kids, they're afraid to put their soul on the line for you to read over it and destroy it. So I think that intentionality is a word here. Like, you have to purposely create low risk opportunities so that kids feel more comfortable in writing, and they get used to your feedback and they trust your opinion to give them feedback and know that you value them as a student, you value their writing, and you really do want to help them. But I think that trust and that coaching and that mentoring is really important.
Hanna, as you're writing for different classes, do you feel that trust, or do you feel like, oh no?
I mean, maybe some classes I did, but honestly, like this year, my teacher, Mr. Ingram, he got us to read this book, I'm Not Dying With You Tonight. And then after that, we just had a whole conversation. It wasn't, I mean, we weren't cussing or anything like that, but it wasn't censored as in some stuff we couldn't talk about. So it was just open conversation. And then he got us to do a project where we wrote a poem or did a song or anything like that, and just write it all down, anything that we felt. And he would give us one-on-one conferences if we needed help, or just to see where we're at, honestly, to make sure that we're on the right track. But I think that when you make a personal connection with the teacher, or just a teacher just trying to have a connection and conversation with you, that builds more trust, because you don't want to butcher your grade by putting your soul out there, and then it's like, oh man, now I'm failing. But then you also want to show them your creative side. So I think when you try and have a connection with everyone in the class and with your teacher, I think that builds a good amount of trust.
All of this sounds so subjective to me. And maybe it's supposed to be subjective. You're choosing which stories are important for young people to hear and to see and to read. You're talking about how a story should be told and which words, and this has to be capitalized or not, or whatever. And it takes a long time, because as Maureen began the whole conversation with, English is hard. It's a tough thing to teach. It also occupies a lot of time in the 10,000 instructional hours that teachers get to work with students over the course of K through 12. It occupies 10 or 15% of that time. It's a major player. And yet, we've got a ridiculously high illiteracy rate. We have most people not having books in the house, and we have most people writing very poorly, and spelling we'll do in a whole nother hour, right? Spelling and punctuation, but we'll take that apart. So, and you guys are very hopeful and very optimistic and very involved and very engaged. And I'm sure very good teachers, very good students, but most people aren't. And that, number one, makes all of us sad, because we know the joy that all of this can bring, and the confidence and the communication and all of that. So maybe we should spend less time and set a lower standard, or maybe we should spend more time, blow up half of math or something, and spend more time. I mean, this isn't fixed. We all made up how many hours we would spend doing whatever. So more time, less time, do it differently? And we're going to close out on that, but I'm going to go around so that everybody has a thought on that. So we're going to spend more time or less time? And if we spend more time, what are we going to lavish it on? And if we spend less time, what are we going to cut out because it just isn't working or for some other reason? So who wants to go first? All right, Maureen, it's yours.
So I would absolutely say, regarding this question, for one thing, some of the stats that you've given us to kind of work with as evidence of this isn't working, and I agree with you, those are based on adults that have gone through the educational system and are done. So, and the folks that are here that are having this conversation, I've been really encouraged by, because we're hearing a lot of cutting edge, recent, like less than 10 years old pedagogical type of ideas. Like, hey, here's this new idea, here's this new insight, here's this new tool. So I think we have some reason for optimism. But I would also say more time, more neuroscience, and more of what everybody here has been talking about: culturally responsive teaching, trauma-informed teaching. Every single school-age child in America has been exposed to trauma over the past year. We know that that leaves a physical imprint in one's brain wiring. So what we teach, how we teach it, is going to have to shift. And we're not going to see those impacts for a couple of years, because these are children we're talking about. They're in development. So let's spend more time. Let's use more of what science and neuroscience and psychology and sociology have to tell us. And let's try to ditch some of those traditional methods that, as you have indicated, just aren't working.
Nina, yours.
I agree. I think that maybe we need to have a different focus. I don't think we should necessarily spend less time on any other subject, but maybe find more ways to incorporate reading and writing into those other subjects, so that we have maybe more of like a well-rounded approach and a well-rounded perspective as to what reading and writing can become and can take us in the future.
Laura. More or less?
Well, I'm coming from a different perspective. I'm not in secondary. I'm really talking about beginning reading. And, to me, we need more time in early instruction so that our kids can get it right early on, so that we don't have to spend so much time in intervention. So really taking this preventative approach and using that 40 plus years of information from multiple disciplines of study to inform how we instruct kids. So the other thing I'd say, let's put some more time into teacher preparation and teacher professional development to help support our teachers in understanding how to do this really well.
Cool.
Teach kids to read.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Andrew.
I would argue for more time, or like Nina said, incorporate that more into our other subjects, as the stuff we are learning now is going to carry us on throughout our life. You have to know how to write college essays to get into college. You have to know how to write research papers, et cetera, et cetera. But I would also argue that this focus on standardized testing can hurt us, because the focus in on these specific subjects that students may not find as interesting hurts us.
Cool. Cavetta?
I would like to see less time spent on the standards and more time spent on the experience. I think that it needs to be packaged differently when it comes to literacy, and kids should really see literacy throughout all content areas versus it just being the responsibility of their English teachers.
Very good. And Hanna?
I agree with what everybody said. I agree with Nina on incorporating reading into all the subjects more, because if you can't read, then you can't understand the math problems. You can't understand what they're asking you in social study. You have to know those kind of things. But I also think we should keep the bar high. We should have more understanding that everyone does not come from the same home, the same background, or know how to read or write all the same. But we should always keep the bar high, because if you keep the bar low, then students are going to be like, well, as long as I'm in this low range, I'll make it through. But if you set the bar high, you don't reach it, that's fine. It just tells you I need to improve this way to get to the bar, to get high to the bar, because we want everyone to be the best they can be. So setting the bar high is what we need to keep doing.
Ashley.
More, and I don't mean extending the English class and extra class period. I mean more across the whole school day. Like the other students have said, more reading and writing integration in content classes and all, even electives in all classes. Students should be reading and writing and reading with purpose, not just reading an article and answering 5 questions. Like reading and having opportunities to engage with their peers, to discuss, to collaborate, to critically think. So more purposeful reading instruction, but I think that also means more professional learning and professional development for teachers as well.
Very good. And so unfortunately, we lost Jessica because we ran a few minutes late on time, but I think we have a pretty good cross-section of ideas here. And thank you all so much. We're going to roll the credits. And if you guys want to hang out for a couple of minutes afterwards, we can kind of wrap up just among ourselves. For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.